We're going to bring in Erin Dwyer. She is a professor of history over at Oakland University. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I just saw on Facebook someone posted a quote from Abraham Lincoln that says, "We are not enemies, but friends." And he had um, did that or released that quote, said that quote prior or just after the election because it was so contentious. Will we survive this?
I believe I'm not psychic. I'm merely a history professor. But I do find comfort from looking to the past and seeing what our nation has endured in the past. And I don't see any exact corollaries, but we can see a lot of parallels that we can learn from and that can be instructive for us moving forward.
And with that, obviously, this is a different day and time. And with our technology and social media that we have now, it does spread the word so much quicker, along with disinformation. But what does looking to our past and to the history, what can it teach us about what we're going through right now?
I think part of the question is who is doing the learning. So you bring up Abraham Lincoln, and I think he was uniquely suited to having been elected on the brink of secession. He's elected in November 1860, and within weeks, South Carolina had seceded. So when he was inaugurated, and at that time, the inauguration took place in March. So imagine an even longer stretch of waiting, an even longer lame duck period between American voters having their say in who should lead the country and that person getting to take over. And repeatedly, Lincoln really tried to be a president of union and of bringing the nation together. And when he ran for office again in 1864, he even would call himself the candidate of the party of union. So he didn't even play up the idea of the Republican Party. He repeatedly talked about, quote, the party of union. And so I think we can look to this idea of, starting from the top, thinking about healing a nation, bringing a nation together, and seeing how at these moments of national crisis or at these moments of a national crux, looking to leaders who are talking about bringing a nation together and being a leader for all Americans.
So there is hope for us going into this election for so many people that are stressed out about the election. I think I read one poll where stress about the upcoming election is weighing so heavily for so many people. But this isn't necessarily new, what we're going through, and we will come out of it on the other side.
Yes, but it deserves to be noted that if it feels like we are all dealing with an unprecedented amount of stress, it is because truly this is unprecedented. I think as a historian, especially in the early days of the pandemic, people kept saying, what is this like? Has there been a moment like this before? I even wrote to some of my grandparents, since we can't be visiting them right now, to say, have you ever lived through something like this before? Um, and what we see is essentially we are living through the 1918 pandemic, but with enough technology that we can be continuing to be having school remotely, going to work remotely. I'm obviously doing this interview remotely. And so that's a real dissonance that didn't exist in the 1918 pandemic. Then add to that, on top of it, the essentially the job loss numbers that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And then add to that a really partisan political campaign and presidential election. So, it is not. To say that we will survive this election is not to say that this isn't an unprecedented stressful time that we are living through, that historians really are struggling to find exact corollaries for, because it is so many different types of crisis concurrently, essentially.
Erin Dwyer with us here on the Oakland County Megacast. She is a PhD and a professor of history from Oakland University. The presidential race of 1876. I'm from Ohio and it was actually back in the area. The President Hayes was from Fremont. I'm from Tiffin. So, as a child growing up, we got to visit his house and things of that nature. that race is so fascinating. Even though it was 1876, there was no real clear winner. It took a long time, and we're hearing this presidential election that there may not be a winner for a while. There are parallels that are kind of happening
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, that's a great one, and you're right. I will pause and say that yes, the prevalence of technology makes us think that this is sort of a that elections are football games that are decided the night of, and that's really a fairly modern phenomenon. When I'm reading 19th century diaries, it really is this stretch of time. I mean, when people are relying on railroads and telegraphs, yeah, it's an election night. Uh, um, Certainty about who has won is really a modern construct. Um, but yeah, the 1876 election of Samuel Tilden was the Democratic candidate against Rutherford B. Hayes is getting a lot of attention these days because exactly as you mentioned, it took so long to be determined, and it was really on the eve of the inauguration that the outcome was settled in a pretty decisive compromise. And the parallels that I see, some of it is about how long it took because there was essentially a tie in the electoral college, and so the question was, how do you settle that compromise between the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden, who had won more of the popular vote, but how do they determine that a few swing states where it was divided, and so the electoral college vote was undetermined. And so it was interesting too, because going into that election, we do see some more parallels with what we're seeing now. In the South, in particular, in the southern states in the 1870s, after the 15th Amendment had been passed, giving Black men the ability to vote, giving them the right to vote, there was still a serious voter disenfranchisement happening, primarily in southern states like South Carolina, like Louisiana, and like Florida, where the population was roughly 50%, if not 60% African American. And so there were concerns in those states about being outvoted. And so there were a lot of really anti democratic attempts to be stealing the election, to be stealing votes, and to be intimidating voters through violence at the polls. A number of really some of the most infamous riots, essentially mass lynchings that took place throughout the South, were in the early 1870s, trying to suppress the Black vote in these states, in states like Louisiana and South Carolina in particular. And so President Grant, who was in his second term, finishing his second term in 1876, he had frequently sent troops into the South to put down those riots, to try to say that his administration would support efforts to vote by Black people and wouldn't see them disenfranchised through essentially white supremacist violence. But there was a lot of resentment amongst white Southerners about that continued military presence, a military occupation of Reconstruction. And so what would then be compromised on the eve of the inauguration was that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, would be given the win in the election. But in return, the occupation, as Southerners, white Southerners saw it, military Reconstruction would be ended. And with it, that meant ending federal support for trying to ensure that Black men were able to exercise their right to vote. So it's in that election, I see not only parallels with voter intimidation and efforts to not count votes, I also see a lot of parallels with, is this compromise then selling out the vote of people? Was in getting Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency, was the choice to maintain power over really representing people who had elected, representing voters. So, yeah, a lot of interesting parallels, and because Rutherford B. Hayes was given that presidency, and because then military occupation in the South was ended, Reconstruction was ended. it's only a few short years after that that southern states will start to implement Jim Crow laws that remove the black vote, remove the right of black men to vote. And so really that election is so consequential because then black men in the South would be unable to vote for really almost 90 years.
Dr. Dwyer, we're hearing stories as we get closer to tomorrow, to election day, and as we go into the process of tallying the votes and determining who will be our president for the next 4 years. So that people are going to the grocery stores, and some are starting to stock up on food and other general items. We've heard reports that police departments are bracing for increased violence or potential rioting, regardless of the results of the 2020 election. Looking back to the mid to late 1800s, as we approach the Second Civil War, there seems to be a concern, particularly in social media, that we're at a similar point in our history. Are there actual parallels between the contentiousness of that time in our country and now, or are we just overblowing that with our social media landscape today, and really we're not even really close to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say. I think social media is really still a new enough phenomenon for how it can amplify a bit of an echo chamber, that people can have a bubbled perspective that is being mirrored back at them. So I think that can be a misleading place to get prognostications about our future. I think the other place where the parallel starts to get a little tricky is that when secession began, when South Carolina is the first to secede after Lincoln's election, and really as a direct result of his election, South Carolina secedes, and it's followed by other states in the Deep South. But what we see today that's much more complicated, I think the kind of election map, football game, red state, blue state, belies the fact that our states are incredibly mixed. I mean, we know this to be true of Michigan, which is a swing state. Before I moved to Detroit, I lived in New Orleans, a blue pocket in a red state. And so it's a lot more complicated to talk about a physical separation of sort of civil war. Now, are we potentially going to witness more an uptick in white supremacist violence in particular? Well, yes, the FBI has been warning about that for years. The FBI for years has been saying that they're seeing a rise in right-wing white supremacist violence. I mean, we saw that in our own state alone with efforts to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. So, but do I see that leading to a physical secession? Let's just say that in all of the history of the United States, secession has never gone well for secessionists. Not the least of which, because when we think about how federal funding to states works, that is the least likely scenario in my view.
It's fascinating to look at history and to see things were so different. They were documented much differently than what we're documenting them today, which also makes you wonder, back in the day when typically it was the white male who was able to read and write, and therefore a lot of our history is coming through their eyes. But today we're able to document history in so many different forms in so many different ways. When you're studying history, does that play into some of your thought process as to who was actually documenting the history?
Yeah, I love that question. And because I write in particular, most of my research is on the history of slavery, so I'm confronted with very limited source base. There are perhaps 200 book-length slave narratives when, at the end of the Civil War alone, roughly 4 million people were enslaved. So that's really a drop in the bucket. But then historians of the 21st century will have the opposite problem, because historians 20, 30, 40 years from now, they'll be looking at our tweets, they'll be looking at Facebook, they'll be looking at Instagram, and think about the volume that then will exist of sources. So it's a different problem for a different source base. But I would encourage, when I have been stressed as a parent, as a working parent, about a pandemic and raising a child in pandemic, I do think about telling my daughter about this 10 years from now, because it's inherently imagining a future in which this pandemic, this stress about the 2020 election, it's imagining a future in which that's not happening anymore. And so I think the other ingredient to this is, because of quarantine, because of social distancing, there is less support for us all to be talking through some of the collective trauma we are experiencing as a nation, undergoing this really unprecedented death toll from COVID, a very different type of death, the distancing that we're all experiencing from one another, uncertainty about jobs, uncertainty about politics. And so, yeah, the historian in me says, start journaling if you aren't already. Write about what you're experiencing. Those sorts of sources will be interesting to historians in the future, and I think it's a way to be working through, outside of the echo chamber of social media, this really unique historic moment in which we find ourselves.
Quickly, before we let you go, just another minute or two with you, let's talk about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is right around the corner, and I didn't realize that Thanksgiving was born out of a way to unite the country.
Yeah, I really love that idea about creating a holiday to unite a nation. So it was in November of 1863, so roughly 9 months after passing the Emancipation Proclamation, and just a few months after the Battle of Gettysburg. And so acknowledging a lengthy war, a really high death toll, Lincoln wanted to make a national holiday. So he has this proclamation that I'm assigning to students for the first time this semester, where he talked about the idea of creating this holiday, trying to unite the nation, and trying to unite the nation in gratitude, to stop and take stock of all the things the nation should be grateful for. So one of the lines from it is, quote, "It has seemed to me fit and proper that we should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged with one heart and one voice by the whole American people." And so the idea was to create this holiday that could be a day of thankfulness and a day of uniting the nation amidst this national crisis. So, of course, at the time, he's only the president of the North. It would take, I believe it's the 1930s before FDR would make it a national holiday for the nation and establish it on the particular Thursday in November. But it was Lincoln thinking about, going back to that idea I mentioned before, that he wanted to be the party of union, and he's thinking about knitting the nation back together with a holiday where people stopped and took stock of what they were grateful for.
That is a great reminder for all of us, and a good place to wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much for being with us. And as a history professor and a lover of history, this time must really excite you, because there's a lot to document, and you wonder how it's going to play out for generations to come. Like in 100 years, how are they going to be viewing the time that we're living through right now?
Yes, may we all live long enough to be reading those history books.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your time as well as your insight here with us on the Oakland County MegaCast.